Hey there, my name's Lisa. I'm the director of creative production at Rally and an art history nerd. Today, I want to talk about Andy Warhol's Marilyn Monroe portraits. But first, this is my dad. You don't know him, but if you ever want to get some conservative-leaning hot takes on modern art, ask him about Andy Warhol and then mention as casually as you can that one of the Marilyn portraits just auctioned for $195 million. While he complains that even he could make this, I admit that I don't think he's wrong exactly, but I do think he's not seeing why those complaints can maybe be true and still also express an idea an artist is trying to relay. Warhol shows us Monroe as a Caesar in ancient Rome and as a saint in the Byzantine Empire with surprisingly little alteration. In this video, we'll talk with a little more context about how an artist-enhanced version of a promotional photo that Warhol didn't even take himself can produce one version that sells at auction for hundreds of millions of dollars, or the millions of units worth tens of dollars, and those that are somewhere in between. Sure, there are flippant answers here, but there is also a historical context from Caesars to saints to press junkets to Madison Avenue that make this specific portrait series both a commentary on icons and also an objectification of value by pop art's own patron sinner, Andy Warhol. So I don't want to act like Warhol critics are monolith, but I do feel like they share a few main complaints with my dad, and we need to set a base layer of discussion. Many criticisms of Warhol's work seem to be around perceptions of simplistic subject matter and just volume. And the volume gripe is further broken down by the rending of garments about quantities, exponential, incremental variation, and a suspicious indirect authorship. It's a combo of 1, it's too commercial to be real art. 2, it doesn't mean anything. And 3, there's just too many. There's too many of the same thing, and we all know that a masterpiece is singular. But Picasso put so much work out into the world that you can buy a signed and numbered print for $7,000 today, just €500 for shipping. And we see constant iteration and revision of ideas in Monet and Rothko. Leonardo and Rembrandt are both examples of artists with many students that they directly trained to mimic their style in a collaborative production setting. And none were the mythical, solitary genius moved by individual inspiration that the founding Western art historians would have us believe. We could act like this is a list of complaints, but it's really more of a Venn diagram, and we'll use the 3 extreme Marilyn portrait examples to talk about each area, because the intensity of the complaint does not match the crime. Warhol had been producing variations of the Marilyn portraits since the actress's sudden death a few years earlier in 1962. What we're showing here is the shot sage blue Marilyn. The shot Marilyns are a very specific set of portraits that were literally shot with a gun by a friend of a friend who stopped by the factory one day in 1964. And the 5 in this set are very, very valuable. These ones obviously have an extraordinary story, which always helps, but they're also done in a specifically laborious process and at an unusual size, which increases their value and prestige. So the value is certainly tied to mechanics of rarity and notoriety, but let's talk about what the Marilyn portraits are doing from an art historical standpoint. And hold on here for just a second, but we're gonna go way back and build this timeline for some very early examples of human ruling classes through the 20th century. It's the greatest hits. There's government, religion, entertainment, and advertising. And our start is in ancient Rome with their innovative portraiture, especially of their institutional leaders. Unlike their contemporaries, the Romans detailed and highlighted aging and individualization, but they also had a very repeated and rigid format with busts that start at the shoulders and the body turned slightly to the side, and they made tons of copies. Sound familiar? Historian Jeremy Tanner puts a pin in it, saying that the act of this honorific portraiture was a strategy for constructing and maintaining new relationships of power and solidarity between rulers and ruled. The repetition in framing and pose reinforced who the elite was, in this case, the noble intellectual class. These Roman portraits showed clearly who was in charge and what the impossible X factor that was needed for power in their society. The age details in the subject alluded to the superiority and quantity of their experience. An attribute that money can't buy wasn't available to the general population, whose life expectancy averaged 22 to 33 years, and allowed someone a place in power. These rulers had years, something the average plebe obviously couldn't understand, and was allocated, like beauty, through a mix of genetics, survivable living conditions, lucky parentage, and social whims. After the fall of the Roman Empire, a really crazy amount of stuff happened in the region, but one of the biggies was the rise of Christianity and its coalescence into the next big patron. The Byzantine Empire existed from the split of Rome in 476 AD through the 15th flipping century, and the art associated with devotion and worship transitioned from the Romans' reverence for wisdom to the early Christian worship of, well, martyrdom? Instead of individualized, recognizable portrait busts, Byzantine artists and their patron, the church, maintained the repeated poses and emphasis on recognizability, but made characters identifiable by traits instead of faces. There was a government-level concern about citizens conflating the entity shown in the icon artwork with the actual icon, the person. So a big part of this was recognizability, and that was achieved through the repetition of idea symbols instead of subtle human features that can be hard to execute by anyone other than a highly trained master artist. This isn't to say that Byzantine painters were no good, but that glyphs used to identify Christ could be sketched or ill-formed and still be recognizable. So in this change, cheekbones were replaced with smoothed, egg-like faces that are divided by sharp, straight noses, and backgrounds were often planes of gold leaf. Characters of saints and the Holy Trinity had consistent hand positions, props, or injuries for quick identification, and all of them used these positions, symbols, and context clues to illustrate the idea of extraordinary holy purity, like the idea of wisdom born of experience in Rome. And just like longevity in Rome, who in the Byzantine Empire had the resources to be this pious? Who could ensure that they followed all the rules of the church when daily life was so freaking hard? Wisdom and purity are both so aspirational, so impossible to guarantee through your own individual actions that they could be goals for normal people to think that the chosen people had actually achieved. And so what's our society's current impossible hamster wheel of aspiration? It's fame, baby. And especially in the case of Marilyn Monroe, it had repeated forms and plenty of standard props. It's the softly curled blonde hair and the pouty red lips, and an hourglass figure and heels, and laughing at everyone's jokes and no obvious competitive or ambitious behavior. It is being demure, but also still alluring. It is all unachievable madness, to be honest. So we see the ties here, right? And how the Marilyn portraits just highlight the idea of fame that she had become the quintessential example of. Jennifer Dyer points out in her article that, considered primarily in terms of their subject matter, Warhol's images continue and rework a tradition of Christian iconography. Since each of these examples, the Caesars, the saints, and the famous, was supremely successful, we're seeing that the art style isn't the main thing, though. It's the honorific placement in piazzas or churches or art museums. So I think it's the translation of a person into an ideal through repetition and aspiration. Like these logos without their company names, a little marketing fairy gets their wings when you recognize that that blue P is PayPal and that softly curled blonde hair is famous Marilyn Monroe. It is propaganda of the individual, literally drawn in broad strokes. And Warhol knew all of this. Jennifer Dyer's article includes a quote from Warhol. "Everything repeats itself," he says. "It's amazing that everyone thinks that everything is new, but it's all a repeat." Warhol was raised Roman Catholic and worked in advertising for years. Remember those logos from a minute ago? The blend of iconoclastic references from his religious youth and the ritual of brand standards from his time in advertising only duplicated the notion that an image repeated becomes a symbol and sheds its identity. Using soup cans and pop culture A-listers and manic colors, Warhol's constant homages to capitalism, arguably the god of 20th century, is both profitable and understandable. But where's the line? Why does a series of 250 have such extraordinary value when the main image is so readily available? What we see with the Marilyn portraits is a concept being used in a very specific balancing act. It's unique enough features to make scarcity, but ubiquitous enough to be instantly recognizable. So the souvenir versions of Warhol's Marilyn portraits keep up the imagery that we've talked so much about, but the mass-produced bags lose the series, the start and the end of a meditative session, the repeated but varying entries that can be identified from each other even when they clearly share so much creative zygote. It's the variance and the hand touch To Professor Elaine Gazda, criticizing a piece because it's part of a series dismisses the advantages of repetition as a conscious artistic strategy. And Monet's haystacks come up as a great corollary in Dyer's article when she loops in curator and artist John Copland's thoughts. He says, time is an effect of serial repetition in Monet. The apparent variation of light suggested by differing value, density, and lumosity of their colors indicates different amounts of daylight and suggests different times of day. Warhol takes the same image, repeats it, and creates in the viewer a strong sense of seeing a whole series of light changes. The handwork of a set of Warhol prints might not have taken a long time, although sometimes it did, but the handwork itself forces observers to consider a passage of time and a repeated thoughtfulness of the subject by the artist. It is a meditation and an observation. And it was the same for Monet's haystacks and Rothko's color fields and Degas' ballerinas. Okay, so what was Warhol trying to say about Marilyn Monroe and how we treated her? The different versions of this same source image reflect the impossibility of our idea of her and of fame. Her treatment by the public and the press removed her humanity. She was the ideal of a compliant, fun-loving, beautiful, good time. To her fans, she was the goddess of delightful ease. And to Warhol, maybe she was a brand image that had already been transformed into a something from a somebody, the blonde version of prepared foods. Or maybe he was more empathetic and his fascination more overt. Because just a couple of years after this, he would be shot by a crazed acquaintance, and he was already famous enough to be iconic with a look that was easy to sketch and have people guess the subject. He was the idea archetype and visual symbol of New York pop art, the current avant-garde, the rejection of classically beautiful art made by a single inspired genius. He was an idea too, and he had lost control of how people talked about his lifestyle, his art, his studio, his friends, his money, and even his faith. It seems like he probably circled around questions about his public persona. Does it matter? Should he change it? What if he just doesn't comment? Over and over and around, a repetition, a meditation, a series with slight variations, with a start and an end. One thing that I know for sure is that my dad gave up on his gripe fest. He still 100% claims that he can make these pictures himself, but he does more often say, that doesn't mean anything to me, then that doesn't mean anything. And today, I can go with that. One last thing, I want to say thanks to the public library systems of Brooklyn and New York City, whose access to JSTOR powers these videos, and the Metropolitan Museum of Art for the amazing public access images and information. And finally, to the Minneapolis Institute of Arts and the Walker Museum for being the scene of so much time with my dad. He still visits both, even though I've moved. Thanks.